Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of tradition echo through marble halls, a single moment in a kitchen would shatter the careful balance of royal protocol. What started as Queen Camilla's innocent attempt to connect with the palace staff would escalate into a scandal so unprecedented that Prince William would issue commands that had never been heard within those ancient walls before. This is the story of how one woman's quest for normalcy in an extraordinary world led to the most dramatic confrontation in modern royal history. A tale where kitchen utensils became weapons of defiance, where centuries-old traditions clashed with human emotions, and where the future King of England would be forced to make a decision that would echo through the monarchy for generations to come. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about life behind palace doors, revealing the raw human drama that unfolds when ordinary people are thrust into the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla made her way down corridors she had walked countless times before, yet today felt different. Today she had made a decision that would have shocked her younger self and certainly surprised the palace staff, who had grown accustomed to her predictable routines. After months of feeling disconnected from the very people who made her royal life possible, Camilla had decided to spend her morning in the castle's main kitchen. Not for a formal inspection or a carefully orchestrated photo opportunity, but simply to be among the hard-working individuals who prepared meals day after day without recognition or fanfare. The idea had come to her during a particularly lonely breakfast 3 weeks earlier, as she sat in the formal dining room being served by staff who moved like ghosts around her. She realized she knew almost nothing about the people who dedicated their lives to serving the royal family. She didn't know if Margaret, the head cook, had children. She had no idea whether James, the young sous chef, enjoyed his work or merely endured it. These thoughts had haunted her, growing stronger each day until she could no longer ignore them. Palace protocol, of course, had specific guidelines about royal interactions with staff. There were proper channels, appropriate times, and established boundaries that had governed royal households for centuries. But Camilla had always been someone who colored outside the lines when it mattered to her heart, and this felt like one of those times. She had informed her personal secretary, Elena Rodriguez, of her intentions the evening before. Elena, a meticulous woman who had served the royal family for over a decade, had immediately begun suggesting alternatives. Perhaps a formal meet and greet in the blue drawing room? Maybe a structured tour where staff could be presented to Her Majesty in an orderly fashion? But Camilla had been firm. She wanted to experience the kitchen as it truly was, not as a sanitized version created for royal consumption. She wanted to see the organized chaos of meal preparation, to understand the rhythm that kept the palace fed, and most importantly, to connect with the people behind the scenes. As she approached the kitchen doors that morning, Camilla could hear the familiar sounds of preparation beginning. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the clatter of pans, and the low murmur of conversation painted a picture of industrious activity that had been background music to her life for years, yet had never truly registered. Margaret Thompson had been the head cook at Windsor Castle for 15 years. She had started as a young assistant, working her way up through determination, skill, and an unwavering attention to detail that had impressed even the most demanding royal tastes. Her kitchen ran like clockwork, with every member of her team understanding their role and executing it with precision. That morning, Margaret was reviewing the day's menu when she noticed an unusual commotion near the service entrance. Her assistant Sarah was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to James, whose face had gone pale. Before Margaret could investigate, the kitchen doors opened and Queen Camilla walked in unannounced. The immediate silence was deafening. 23 members of the kitchen staff froze mid-task, creating a tableau that would have been amusing under different circumstances. A wooden spoon dripped sauce onto the floor. A half-chopped onion sat abandoned on a cutting board. Even the industrial mixers seemed to quiet their mechanical humming. Camilla, dressed more casually than anyone had ever seen her in the palace, smiled warmly and raised her hand in a gentle wave. "Please, don't stop what you're doing," she said. her voice carrying the authority of her position but wrapped in genuine warmth. "I've come to learn not to interrupt." The request was unprecedented. In all her years of service, Margaret had never encountered a situation where royalty asked to observe regular kitchen operations. There were established protocols for royal visits to the kitchen, all of which involved extensive preparation, formal presentations, and carefully choreographed interactions. This was entirely uncharted territory. James, still holding a whisk he had been using to prepare a sauce, found his voice first. "Your Majesty," he stammered, attempting a bow while still clutching the kitchen implement. "We weren't expecting, we would have prepared." "That's exactly why I didn't announce myself," Camilla interrupted gently. "I wanted to see how you really work, not a performance created for my benefit." Margaret, drawing upon years of experience managing unexpected situations, stepped forward and performed a proper curtsy. "Your Majesty, we are honored by your presence. Would you prefer we prepare a demonstration of specific techniques, or perhaps you'd like to see the menu planning process?" But Camilla shook her head. "I'd like to learn how to prepare something myself, something real that you would actually serve." The request sent a wave of barely concealed panic through the kitchen staff. The idea of royalty actually participating in food preparation raised numerous concerns about safety, protocol, and potential disasters. What if she cut herself? What if she burned something? What if she contaminated the food somehow? The implications seemed endless and terrifying. Sarah, a woman in her 30s who had been working in royal kitchens since she was 18, exchanged glances with her colleagues. She had trained under Margaret and had developed a reputation for being able to handle unusual requests with grace and efficiency. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we would be honored to teach you," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Perhaps we could start with something straightforward. We're preparing a traditional shepherd's pie today for the staff meal. It's honest, hearty cooking." Camilla's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That sounds perfect. I've always wanted to know how to make a proper shepherd's pie from scratch." What followed was perhaps the most unusual morning in Windsor Castle's kitchen history. Camilla rolled up her sleeves, literally and figuratively, diving into the process of preparing vegetables, browning meat, and learning the intricacies of creating the perfect mashed potato topping. She listened intently as Margaret explained the importance of properly seasoning each layer, took notes on her phone when Sarah demonstrated the technique for achieving the ideal meat-to-vegetable ratio, and laughed genuinely when she accidentally added too much salt to her first attempt at the potato mixture. The kitchen staff, initially terrified of making any mistake that might offend or embarrass the Queen, gradually relaxed as they witnessed her genuine enthusiasm and self-deprecating humor. When she dropped a wooden spoon and it clattered loudly on the stone floor, she looked around with mock concern and said, "Do I get fired for that, or just demoted to dish duty?" The resulting laughter broke the remaining tension, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the royal kitchen felt like a normal workplace where colleagues were sharing knowledge and enjoying each other's company. As the morning progressed, Camilla learned not just about cooking techniques, but about the people who had dedicated their careers to serving her family. She discovered that Margaret had a son studying engineering at university, that Sarah collected vintage cookbooks in her spare time, and that James had dreams of opening his own restaurant someday, but felt honored to perfect his skills in the royal kitchen first. These conversations revealed a depth of humanity that palace life often obscured. These weren't just employees performing functions, they were individuals with dreams, families, and stories that had never been acknowledged or appreciated at the personal level Camilla was experiencing. The shepherd's pie they created together was far from perfect. Camilla's contribution to the mashed potatoes resulted in a slightly lumpy texture, and her enthusiasm for seasoning had made the meat mixture more robust than the traditional recipe called for. But as they pulled the finished dish from the oven, golden and bubbling, there was a sense of genuine accomplishment that none of them had expected. "We did that," Camilla said, looking at the imperfect but hearty meal they had created together. We actually made something real and useful." Margaret, who had been cooking professionally for over 20 years, found herself moved by the Queen's simple joy in the basic act of preparing food. "Your Majesty, you have a natural instinct for flavors. With practice, you could become quite accomplished." As the morning wound down, Camilla made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She asked Margaret if she could return the following week to learn another recipe, not as a formal royal engagement but as a regular occurrence. She wanted to continue learning, continue connecting, and continue being part of this world. She had discovered Margaret, flattered and somewhat overwhelmed, agreed readily. How could she refuse such a request from the Queen? The idea of regular, informal cooking lessons seemed harmless enough, even charming. It would give her staff something unique to take pride in, and it clearly brought joy to Her Majesty. As Camilla prepared to leave the kitchen, she paused at the door and turned back to address the entire staff. "Thank you for welcoming me into your world today. I hope you know how much I appreciate not just the work you do, but who you are as people. I'll see you next week." The kitchen staff watched her go with a mixture of warmth and bewilderment. They had just experienced something unprecedented in their careers, something that would definitely be talked about for years to come. But none of them realized that this innocent morning of cooking and connection had just set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundations of royal protocol. Elena Rodriguez was waiting for Camilla when she returned to her private apartments, a folder full of afternoon appointments in her hands, and a carefully controlled expression of concern on her face. As Camilla recounted her morning with obvious joy and enthusiasm, Elena made mental notes about the implications of what had just transpired. While the Queen's intentions were clearly benevolent and the kitchen staff had been charmed by her genuine interest, Elena recognized potential complications that Camilla, in her happiness, hadn't considered. Regular, unstructured interactions with staff could create issues of favoritism, could disrupt established hierarchies, and could set precedents that other members of the royal family might find problematic. But seeing the genuine happiness in Camilla's demeanor, Elena decided to monitor the situation carefully, rather than raise immediate concerns. After all, what harm could come from the Queen learning to cook? 3 weeks had passed since that first morning in the kitchen, and what had begun as a single impulsive decision had evolved into something much more significant. Every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, Queen Camilla would appear in the kitchen doorway, ready to learn a new recipe and spend time with the staff who had become in many ways the most authentic relationships in her royal life. The transformation had been remarkable. Margaret Thompson found herself looking forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation she hadn't felt about work in years. She would spend her weekends researching traditional recipes that would be both educational for the Queen and manageable within their time constraints. Sarah had taken to preparing ingredient lists and small cards explaining technique nuances that Camilla could take with her. Even James, initially the most nervous about the arrangement, had begun suggesting modifications to recipes that might appeal to royal tastes while maintaining their authentic character. The kitchen itself had begun to reflect this new dynamic. A small notebook had appeared on the main prep counter where staff members jotted down questions they hoped to ask the Queen during her visits. What was it like to travel to so many countries? Did she miss her old life sometimes? Had she always enjoyed cooking? Or was this a recently discovered interest? These questions revealed a curiosity that went both ways. While Camilla was learning about the technical aspects of cooking and the personal lives of her staff, they were discovering that royalty was far more human and accessible than they had ever imagined. The formal distance that had previously characterized all interactions had been replaced by something approaching genuine friendship. On this particular Tuesday, Margaret had planned to teach Camilla how to make a traditional bread pudding using day-old bread from the palace kitchens. It was a practical recipe that demonstrated how professional kitchens avoided waste while creating something delicious. And it required techniques that would challenge Camilla's developing skills without overwhelming her. As they worked together, measuring ingredients and discussing the science behind how custard sets properly, the conversation naturally drifted toward more personal territory. Camilla found herself sharing stories about her childhood attempts at baking, including a disastrous birthday cake that had somehow ended up both burned and undercooked simultaneously. "I thought I had followed the recipe exactly," she laughed, carefully whisking eggs and cream together as Margaret had shown her. "But apparently, I had confused Fahrenheit and Celsius temperatures. The outside was charcoal while the inside was basically raw batter." Sarah, who was preparing vegetables for lunch service while listening to the conversation, looked up from her cutting board. "Your Majesty, may I ask who taught you to cook originally? I mean, before you started coming here?" It was a question that revealed how comfortable the staff had become with their royal visitor. 3 weeks earlier, none of them would have dared ask such a personal question. But the informal atmosphere that had developed made these conversations feel natural and welcomed. "My grandmother, actually," Camilla replied, pausing in her whisking to remember. "She wasn't a particularly skilled cook, mind you, but she was enthusiastic. She believed that every woman should know how to feed her family, regardless of her circumstances. I'm afraid her lessons didn't stick very well over the years." Margaret smiled as she adjusted the oven temperature. "Enthusiasm counts for a lot in cooking. Technique can be learned, but you can't teach someone to care about the food they're making. You clearly care, Your Majesty." These moments of connection had become the highlight of Camilla's week. In a life filled with formal obligations, scripted interactions, and carefully managed public appearances, these Tuesday mornings represented something authentic and unguarded. She could make mistakes, ask questions that might seem foolish, and simply be herself without the weight of royal protocol governing every moment. But while the kitchen had become Camilla's sanctuary, word of her regular visits was beginning to circulate in other parts of the palace. Elena Rodriguez had been fielding increasingly pointed questions from other members of the royal household about the Queen's unusual weekly schedule. Some expressed concern about security protocols being relaxed. Others worried about the precedent being set for informal royal interactions with staff. A few questioned whether such regular, unstructured time with kitchen workers was appropriate for someone in Camilla's position. The most significant concern came from Lady Catherine Morrison, the palace's chief of protocol, who had served the royal family for over 30 years and had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Lady Morrison prided herself on maintaining the traditions and standards that preserve the dignity and proper functioning of the monarchy. In her view, the informal cooking lessons represented a dangerous erosion of necessary boundaries. "Elena," Lady Morrison had said during their meeting the previous Friday, "while Her Majesty's intentions are admirable, we must consider the broader implications. What happens when other staff members request similar informal access? How do we maintain appropriate hierarchies if these boundaries continue to blur?" Elena had defended Camilla's activities, pointing out that the Queen's interactions with the kitchen staff had actually improved morale throughout the household. Other employees had noticed and appreciated the recognition being given to their colleagues. The overall atmosphere in the palace had become warmer and more collegial, but Lady Morrison's concerns were not easily dismissed. She represented decades of institutional knowledge about how royal households functioned most effectively, and her warnings about potential complications deserved serious consideration. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Tuesday's bread pudding lesson was progressing beautifully. Camilla had mastered the technique of creating a smooth custard base, and Margaret was explaining how to arrange the bread pieces for optimal absorption when an unexpected visitor appeared in the kitchen doorway. Prince William stood silently, watching the scene unfold before him. He had been looking for his stepmother to discuss arrangements for an upcoming state visit when Elena had mentioned that she was likely to be found in the kitchen. This was his first direct observation of the cooking lessons that had become such a significant part of Camilla's routine. The immediate silence that fell over the kitchen was different from the comfortable quiet that had developed during Camilla's regular visits. This was the silence of people suddenly aware that they might be observing something they weren't supposed to see. or participating in something that might not be entirely appropriate. Camilla looked up from the bread pudding mixture, her hands still covered in custard, and smiled warmly at her stepson. William! Perfect timing. Margaret was just explaining the difference between baked custards and stovetop versions. Did you know there's actual science involved in preventing curdling? Her enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, but William's expression remained carefully neutral. He was taking in not just the unusual sight of his stepmother covered in flour and custard, but the entire dynamic that had developed in the kitchen. The staff's comfortable familiarity with Camilla, their relaxed postures, the way conversation had been flowing freely until his arrival. All of it painted a picture of a relationship that had evolved far beyond traditional royal staff interactions. I can see you're learning a great deal, William said diplomatically. Perhaps we could speak privately when you have a moment. The careful politeness of his request was not lost on anyone in the kitchen. Margaret immediately began cleaning up the prep area, and the other staff members found sudden urgencies that required their attention elsewhere in the large space. Within minutes, Camilla and William found themselves alone among the stainless steel surfaces and commercial equipment. Elena mentioned that this has become a regular occurrence, William said, his tone carefully measured. Tuesday mornings in the kitchen. Camilla nodded, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. It's been wonderful, actually. I've learned so much, not just about cooking, but about the people who work so hard to make our lives possible. Did you know that Margaret has been here for 15 years and I never knew she had a son? I'm sure it's been enriching, William replied. But I'm wondering if we should discuss the broader implications of these arrangements. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that neither had fully articulated but both understood. This wasn't just about cooking lessons or staff relationships. This was about boundaries, protocols, and the delicate balance that allowed the monarchy to function within modern society, while maintaining its necessary traditions. Camilla studied her stepson's face, reading the concern behind his diplomatic language. She had known this conversation would come eventually. The freedom and authenticity she had found in the kitchen had felt too good to last indefinitely within the constraints of royal life. What specifically concerns you? She asked directly. William considered his words carefully. The informality itself isn't necessarily problematic, but the regularity of it, the depth of the relationships being formed, the way it's begun to affect palace dynamics, these things create complications that might not be immediately obvious. He was thinking of the reports he had received from various palace staff about the changing atmosphere, the questions being raised about equal access and appropriate boundaries, the potential security implications of predictable, informal gatherings. But more than that, he was thinking about the long-term sustainability of what Camilla had created. These people have become important to me, Camilla said simply. For the first time since joining this family, I feel like I have relationships that are based on who I am, not just what I represent. The honesty of her statement struck William deeply. He understood the isolation that came with royal life, the difficulty of forming authentic connections when every interaction was filtered through protocol and position. He could see how much these Tuesday mornings meant to his stepmother, and he genuinely wanted her to be happy and fulfilled in her role. But he also understood the complex ecosystem of royal household management in ways that Camilla, despite her years in the family, still found challenging to navigate. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining certain structures and boundaries, even when they felt artificial or unnecessarily restrictive. I'm not suggesting you stop entirely, William said carefully, but perhaps we could discuss ways to formalize these interactions that would preserve what you value about them while addressing the concerns that are being raised. Camilla felt a familiar sinking sensation, the same feeling she had experienced countless times when authentic moments in her royal life were gradually transformed into managed scripted versions of themselves. She understood William's position and respected his concerns, but the thought of losing the genuine connection she had formed was heartbreaking. What kind of formalization are you thinking about? She asked, though she already suspected the answer would involve scheduled visits, structured activities, and the careful management that would drain the spontaneity and authenticity from her Tuesday mornings. William outlined several possibilities. Perhaps monthly cooking demonstrations could be arranged with proper advance notice and security preparation. Maybe cooking lessons could be incorporated into official palace events where staff achievements could be recognized publicly. There were ways to honor Camilla's interest in cooking and her desire to connect with staff while maintaining appropriate boundaries. As he spoke, Camilla nodded appropriate and made sounds of agreement, but inside she felt something precious slipping away. The magic of her Tuesday mornings hadn't been in the cooking itself, but in the unguarded humanity of the interactions. The moment those interactions became formal events, they would lose the very quality that had made them meaningful. Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret's tentative return to the kitchen area. The bread pudding still needed to go into the oven, and timing was crucial for the custard to set properly. "Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, "should I finish the preparation myself, or would you prefer to continue later?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had just been discussed. Camilla looked at the half-finished dessert they had been creating together, then at William, then back at Margaret's hopeful but uncertain expression. "Let's finish it together," Camilla decided. "William, would you like to learn how to make a proper custard base?" The invitation surprised them all, including Camilla herself. But as William hesitated, clearly torn between the propriety of declining and his genuine curiosity about the experience that had become so important to his stepmother, Margaret made the decision for them. "Your Royal Highness, it would be an honor to show you both how this works," she said, moving to wash a fresh set of measuring tools. "The technique is actually quite straightforward once you understand the principles." What followed was perhaps the most unusual half-hour in recent palace history. The future King of England stood alongside his stepmother in the kitchen, learning to fold bread pieces gently into custard mixture, while Margaret explained the importance of temperature control and timing. William found himself unexpectedly charmed by the normalcy of the activity and the genuine warmth of the interaction. He began to understand more clearly what Camilla had discovered in these sessions, not just the pleasure of learning new skills, but the human connection that came from working together toward a common practical goal. As they slid the bread pudding into the oven and set the timer, William realized that his concerns about boundaries and protocol, while valid, had perhaps been missing a crucial element. The relationships Camilla had formed weren't threatening to royal hierarchy because they challenged authority, but because they demonstrated that authentic human connection was possible within the constraints of palace life. The question was no longer whether these interactions should continue, but how they could be sustained without compromising the legitimate concerns about security, precedent, and proper household management that made the monarchy function effectively. As the timer ticked down on their bread pudding, all three of them sensed that they had just created something more complicated than a dessert. They had created a situation that would require careful navigation in the days and weeks ahead. The weeks following William's unexpected participation in the bread pudding lesson had created an uneasy calm throughout Windsor Castle. While nothing had been officially forbidden, Camilla could sense the increased attention her Tuesday kitchen visits were receiving. Elena Rodriguez had begun asking more pointed questions about the duration and nature of her time with the staff. Lady Morrison had requested detailed reports about the activities during these sessions. Even the security team had started positioning themselves more visibly near the kitchen areas during her visits. The staff, too, had noticed the change in atmosphere. Margaret Thompson found herself second-guessing conversations that had once felt natural and spontaneous. Sarah had begun preparing more structured lesson plans rather than allowing their cooking sessions to evolve organically. The easy camaraderie that had developed was being slowly but steadily eroded by the weight of increased scrutiny. Despite these pressures, Camilla was determined to maintain her Tuesday tradition. The relationship she had built with the kitchen staff had become too important to sacrifice to bureaucratic concerns. She had finally found a place within the royal structure where she felt valued for her authentic self rather than her title, and she was prepared to fight to preserve it. On this particular Tuesday, Margaret had planned to teach Camilla how to prepare a traditional Victoria sponge cake. complete with homemade jam and fresh whipped cream. It was a quintessentially British recipe that required precision timing and technique, the kind of challenge that Camilla had come to relish during her weekly lessons. As they began measuring flour and sugar, Camilla noticed that Margaret seemed unusually reserved. The comfortable chatter that typically accompanied their cooking sessions had been replaced by a more formal instructional approach that felt stilted and uncomfortable. "Margaret," Camilla said gently as she creamed butter and sugar together, "you seem different today." "Is everything all right?" Margaret paused in her explanation of proper egg incorporation techniques, clearly struggling with whether to address the elephant in the room. After 15 years of palace service, she had learned to navigate difficult conversations carefully, but this situation presented challenges she had never encountered before. "Your Majesty," she began hesitantly, "I've been wondering if these lessons have become burdensome for you. I know your schedule is incredibly demanding, and I wouldn't want you to feel obligated to continue if your priorities have changed." The carefully diplomatic language wasn't fooling anyone. Camilla recognized the underlying message. Someone had been applying pressure to discourage these weekly gatherings, and Margaret was trying to provide an easy exit that would preserve everyone's dignity. "Margaret," Camilla said firmly, setting down her whisk and giving the older woman her full attention. "These Tuesday mornings are not burdensome. They are the highlight of my week. Has someone suggested otherwise?" Before Margaret could answer, Lady Catherine Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that could have curdled milk. Behind her stood Elena Rodriguez, looking deeply uncomfortable, and two security personnel whose presence immediately transformed the warm kitchen atmosphere into something resembling a formal tribunal. "Your Majesty," Lady Morrison said with crisp efficiency, "I apologize for the interruption, but we need to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding these informal gatherings." The use of the phrase "informal gatherings" was particularly pointed. In Lady Morrison's vocabulary, anything described as informal within royal context was inherently problematic and needed immediate correction. Camilla felt her temper beginning to rise, but years of royal training had taught her to maintain composure even in frustrating circumstances. "Of course, Lady Morrison. What concerns are you referring to?" Lady Morrison glanced meaningfully at Margaret and the other kitchen staff, clearly indicating that this conversation should not take place in front of them. But Camilla, recognizing the power play, remained precisely where she was. "I prefer to address concerns openly and directly," Camilla said calmly. "Please continue." The standoff was brief but significant. Lady Morrison had expected Camilla to defer to protocol and move their discussion to a more appropriate venue. When this didn't happen, she found herself in the uncomfortable position of either backing down or proceeding with a confrontation in front of staff members who had never witnessed such high-level palace tensions. "Very well," Lady Morrison said stiffly. "We've received reports of security breaches during these sessions. Kitchen knives and other potential weapons have been readily accessible without proper oversight. Food preparation areas present contamination risks that haven't been properly assessed. And the informal nature of these interactions has created expectations among staff that may be inappropriate for the long-term functioning of the household." Each accusation hit like a carefully aimed dart. The security concerns, while technically valid, were clearly exaggerated. The palace kitchen had always contained knives and other equipment without being considered a security risk. The contamination concerns were similarly overblown, given that the same staff prepared royal meals daily without incident. The real issue, thinly veiled behind these practical objections, was the disruption to established hierarchies. Margaret Thompson, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally reached her breaking point. 15 years of dedicated service, countless hours of overtime, and unwavering loyalty to the royal family had earned her the right to speak up when her professional competence was being questioned. "Lady Morrison," she said with quiet dignity, "I have been responsible for kitchen safety and food security in this palace for 15 years without a single incident. The suggestion that Her Majesty's presence somehow compromises these standards is both inaccurate and insulting to my professional capabilities." The boldness of Margaret's response sent a visible shock through the room. Kitchen staff simply didn't contradict senior palace officials, particularly not in defense of informal arrangements that were already under scrutiny. By speaking up, Margaret had essentially declared herself willing to risk her career to defend the cooking lessons that had become so meaningful to all of them. Lady Morrison's face flushed with a combination of surprise and indignation. "Mrs. Thompson, your dedication is not in question. However, protocols exist for reasons that extend beyond immediate safety concerns. The precedents being set here have implications that you may not fully understand." "What precedents?" Camilla interjected, her voice carrying a steel edge that none of them had heard before. "The precedent of treating staff members as human beings? The precedent of learning practical skills? The precedent of having genuine conversations with the people who dedicate their lives to serving this family?" The confrontation was escalating beyond what anyone had intended. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation before it reached a point of no return. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could schedule a private meeting to discuss these concerns in detail and explore solutions that address everyone's needs?" But Camilla was no longer interested in diplomatic solutions. Months of accumulated frustration with the constraints of royal life, combined with the very real threat to relationships she had come to treasure, had finally pushed her beyond the boundaries of careful protocol. "No, Elena, I think we need to resolve this right now, in front of the people who are actually affected by these decisions." She turned to address Lady Morrison directly, her posture straightening into something that reminded everyone present that she was in fact the Queen. "Lady Morrison, I understand your concerns about protocol and precedent, but I need you to understand something as well. For the first time since joining this family, I have found a place where I feel useful, appreciated, and authentic. These Tuesday mornings have given me relationships that sustain me through weeks of formal obligations and scripted interactions. I will not surrender them to bureaucratic convenience." The silence that followed was deafening. No one in the room had ever heard a member of the royal family speak so directly about the personal costs of royal duty or assert their personal needs so forcefully against institutional pressure. Lady Morrison, who had navigated palace politics for 3 decades, recognized that she was facing a situation that required careful handling. A direct confrontation with the Queen, witnessed by staff members, could have consequences that extended far beyond this kitchen. "Your Majesty," she said, choosing her words with extreme care, "our concern is not with your personal fulfillment, but with the sustainability of these arrangements and their impact on the broader household." "Then let's discuss sustainability," Camilla replied. "What specifically would need to change for these lessons to continue without causing the problems you're worried about?" The question was reasonable and direct, forcing Lady Morrison to move beyond vague objections to specific, actionable concerns. But as she began to outline the modifications that would be necessary, advanced security clearance for each session, formal documentation of activities, structured agendas approved in advance, limited participation by pre-selected staff members, it became clear that her solutions would eliminate everything that made the cooking lessons meaningful. Margaret listened to this list of requirements with growing dismay. The spontaneous conversations, the ability to adjust lessons based on natural learning progression, the comfortable familiarity that had developed between the Queen and her staff, all of it would be sacrificed to create a sanitized version that satisfied protocol requirements while destroying the human connections that had made the experience valuable. "Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, "with respect to Lady Morrison's concerns, perhaps it would be better to discontinue the lessons rather than transform them into something that serves neither your interests nor our professional development." The suggestion was both practical and heartbreaking. Margaret was essentially offering to sacrifice something precious to everyone involved rather than watch it be slowly strangled by bureaucratic requirements. But before Camilla could respond, they were all surprised by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Prince William appeared in the kitchen doorway, having been summoned by Elena Rodriguez when the situation began escalating beyond normal parameters. William took in the scene immediately. His stepmother's defensive posture, Lady Morrison's rigid formality, the visible distress of the kitchen staff, and the overall atmosphere of confrontation that had replaced the warm learning environment he had witnessed weeks earlier. "I apologize for interrupting," he said with calm authority, "but I understand there's been some discussion about the future of these cooking lessons." Lady Morrison turned to address him with visible relief, clearly hoping that he would support her position and help resolve the situation in favor of established protocol. "Your Royal Highness, we've been attempting to address several concerns about the sustainability and appropriateness of these informal arrangements." William nodded thoughtfully, but instead of immediately supporting Lady Morrison's position, he addressed Margaret directly. "Mrs. Thompson, from your perspective, have these sessions created any practical difficulties in managing your kitchen operations or maintaining food safety standards?" The question surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. She had expected William to focus on protocol concerns rather than operational realities. "No, Your Royal Highness," she answered honestly. "If anything, Her Majesty's presence has improved morale and given the staff additional motivation to excel in their duties." William nodded, then turned to address the security personnel who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "From a security standpoint, have you identified any actual risks during these sessions that weren't already present during normal kitchen operations?" The senior security officer, clearly uncomfortable with being asked to contradict concerns that had been raised by palace officials. "Sir, the existing security protocols for this area of the palace are adequate for normal operations, including Her Majesty's cooking lessons." With two quick questions, William had established that the practical objections to Camilla's Tuesday mornings were largely theoretical rather than based on actual operational problems. This shifted the discussion back to its real focus. "Lady Morrison," William said, "your concerns about precedent and long-term implications are valid and important. But I think we need to find a solution that preserves the value these sessions clearly provide, while addressing legitimate institutional needs." He paused, considering his options carefully. As the future king, his words in this situation would carry enormous weight and could set precedents that would affect royal household management for years to come. "I propose that these cooking lessons continue on their current schedule, but with some minor modifications to address security documentation requirements. Mrs. Thompson will provide brief summaries of planned activities for security review, not for approval, but for awareness. Her Majesty will maintain her current access and interaction level with staff, but we'll ensure that other household departments understand this is a specific arrangement related to educational and morale benefits." The compromise was elegant in its simplicity. It preserved the authentic nature of the cooking lessons while providing enough structure to address legitimate administrative concerns. Most importantly, it established clear royal support for the arrangements, making future challenges much less likely. Lady Morrison's expression suggested she was not entirely satisfied with this resolution, but William's authority in the matter was unquestionable. "Very well, Your Royal Highness. Prepare the necessary documentation to formalize these arrangements." As the various officials began to disperse and normal kitchen activities slowly resumed, Camilla found herself alone with William and Margaret. The Victoria sponge they had begun preparing sat abandoned on the prep counter, its half-mixed ingredients a reminder of how quickly normal activities could be disrupted by palace politics. "Thank you," Camilla said to William. "I know this wasn't easy for you." William smiled, picking up the whisk she had abandoned earlier. "Actually, I've been thinking about our bread pudding lesson. I believe I still have some things to learn about proper custard technique." Margaret, who had been quietly cleaning up the disruption caused by the impromptu meeting, looked up with surprise and cautious hope. "Your Royal Highness, you're welcome to join our lessons anytime you'd like." "In fact," William continued, "I think these Tuesday sessions might be exactly what the palace needs. A reminder that the people who serve this family deserve to be valued as individuals, not just as functions." As they returned to their Victoria sponge preparation, all three of them understood that something significant had just occurred. The kitchen had become a battlefield, And while they had won this particular confrontation, the war for authentic human connection within the constraints of royal life was far from over. 6 weeks had passed since William's intervention had secured the future of Camilla's Tuesday cooking lessons, and what had emerged from that confrontation was something neither expected nor entirely welcome. The compromise that had seemed so elegant in the moment had created unintended consequences that were now rippling through every level of the palace hierarchy. Word of the Queen's cooking lessons had spread beyond the kitchen staff to other departments throughout Windsor Castle. The housekeeping staff had begun requesting similar informal access to Her Majesty. The gardening crew had suggested that she might enjoy learning about organic vegetable cultivation. Even the maintenance team had proposed teaching her basic repair techniques, arguing that practical skills were valuable for everyone regardless of position. Each request, while individually reasonable, collectively represented exactly the kind of precedent-setting that Lady Morrison had warned about. The carefully controlled access to royal family members that had maintained palace operations for centuries was beginning to break down under the weight of democratic expectations. Elena Rodriguez found herself fielding increasingly complex scheduling requests as various staff groups sought to establish their own regular sessions with the Queen. The security team was struggling to assess and plan for multiple informal gatherings. The protocol office was receiving complaints from other royal households about the unusual arrangements at Windsor Castle. But the most significant complication was emerging from an unexpected source: the kitchen staff themselves. What had begun as Camilla's attempt to connect with hardworking employees had evolved into something more complex and potentially problematic. Margaret Thompson, Sarah, and James had become, whether intentionally or not, a privileged group within the palace hierarchy. Their weekly access to the Queen, their growing comfort with informal royal interaction, and their increasing confidence in expressing opinions about palace operations had created tensions with other staff members who felt excluded from this inner circle. The situation had reached a tipping point. The previous Thursday, when Sarah had mentioned during a staff meeting that the Queen had expressed interest in learning more about the palace's food sourcing practices. This innocent comment had been interpreted by some as royal criticism of current procurement procedures, leading to defensive reactions from the purchasing department and complaints to senior management about kitchen staff overstepping their boundaries. Margaret had tried to explain that Camilla's questions had been motivated by genuine curiosity rather than implied criticism, but the damage was done. The cooking lessons that had once been a source of pride for the entire kitchen had become a source of division and resentment that was affecting the broader palace community. On this Tuesday morning, as Camilla arrived for her weekly lesson, she was immediately aware that something had changed. The usual warm greetings were replaced by polite but formal acknowledgments. Margaret's smile seemed forced, and Sarah appeared to be avoiding direct eye contact. "Good morning, everyone," Camilla said, trying to maintain the cheerful tone that had characterized these sessions. "What are we learning today?" Margaret gestured toward a collection of ingredients arranged on the main prep counter. "We thought we'd try making fresh pasta, Your Majesty. It's a technique that requires some practice but can be quite satisfying once mastered." The response was perfectly appropriate but lacked the enthusiasm that had become the hallmark of their Tuesday interactions. Camilla could sense the underlying tension but wasn't sure how to address it without potentially making the situation worse. As they began mixing flour and eggs to create pasta dough, the conversation remained focused strictly on technique and process. The personal stories, gentle teasing, and comfortable silences that had developed over months of shared cooking experiences were noticeably absent. "Margaret," Camilla said quietly as she kneaded the developing dough, "have I done something to upset the staff? Everyone seems different today." Margaret's hands stilled on her own portion of dough as she considered how to respond. After weeks of navigating the increasingly complex political implications of their cooking lessons, she had been dreading this conversation. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "the staff appreciates these lessons more than I can express, but I think we're all beginning to realize that what we've created here has implications beyond what any of us anticipated." Before Camilla could ask for clarification, they were interrupted by the arrival of James, who appeared unusually agitated as he approached their workstation. "Margaret," he said urgently. "We need to talk. There's been a problem." Margaret looked from James to the Queen, clearly torn between her loyalty to Camilla and her responsibility to address whatever crisis had emerged. "James, perhaps this could wait until after our lesson," she suggested diplomatically. But James was too upset to recognize the diplomatic undercurrents of the situation. "The head of purchasing is demanding a meeting with you about the procurement comments. He's saying that kitchen staff have been undermining established vendor relationships by suggesting that sourcing practices need royal review." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, revealing the exact kind of political complication that everyone had been trying to avoid. Camilla's innocent questions about food sourcing, filtered through staff interpretation and palace gossip, had been transformed into accusations of criticism and demands for change. Camilla felt a familiar sinking sensation as she realized that her attempts to engage authentically with palace operations had created exactly the kind of disruption that William and Lady Morrison had been concerned about from the beginning. "I see," she said quietly, setting down her dough. "And what other problems have emerged from our cooking lessons?" The question was direct and painful, but it needed to be asked. Margaret and James exchanged glances before Margaret took a deep breath and decided to explain the full scope of the situation. "Your Majesty, the housekeeping staff feels that kitchen workers have been given preferential access that they haven't been offered. The maintenance crew is questioning why their contributions to palace operations aren't considered worthy of similar recognition. And several department heads are concerned that informal royal interactions are undermining established reporting structures." Each revelation made Camilla's heart sink further. Her Tuesday morning sanctuary had become a source of discord and resentment throughout the palace community. The very people she had hoped to honor and appreciate were now facing criticism and political pressure because of her attention. "Additionally," Margaret continued reluctantly, "some staff members in other departments have been questioning whether kitchen workers are sharing information about royal preferences and private conversations inappropriately. This accusation stung most deeply because it struck at the heart of what had made the cooking lessons meaningful. The trust and genuine connection that had developed between Camilla and the kitchen staff was being questioned and devalued by people who had never experienced it directly. Sarah, who had been silently preparing pasta ingredients throughout this conversation, "Your Majesty, we would never betray your trust or share private conversations. But some people seem to think that because we've become comfortable talking with you, we must be gossiping about you." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. These weekly sessions had been as meaningful to the staff as they had been to Camilla, but the political complications were threatening to destroy not just the lessons themselves, but the reputations of the people involved. Camilla looked around the kitchen that had become her haven, seeing it now through the lens of political complexity rather than personal connection. Every warm conversation had been filtered through palace gossip networks. Every casual question had been analyzed for hidden meanings and implications. Every moment of authentic human interaction had been transformed into a potential source of controversy. "I think," she said slowly, "I've created problems for all of you that I never intended." Before anyone could respond, Lady Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression grave and her posture suggesting that this was not a casual visit. "Your Majesty," she said formally, "I need to speak with you immediately about a situation that has developed." The tone was different from their previous confrontation. This wasn't about protocol preferences or theoretical concerns. This was about a real crisis that required immediate attention. "Of course," Camilla replied, though she dreaded hearing what new complications had emerged. Lady Morrison glanced meaningfully at the kitchen staff, but Camilla, remembering their previous encounter, remained where she was. "Please continue, Lady Morrison." "Very well. We've received a formal complaint from the Palace Workers' Union about preferential treatment being given to kitchen staff through these cooking lessons. They're demanding either equal access for all palace employees or discontinuation of the program entirely." The words hit like a physical blow. The cooking lessons that had started as Camilla's simple desire to connect with hard-working people had escalated into a formal labor relations issue that threatened to disrupt palace operations at the highest levels. Furthermore, Lady Morrison continued relentlessly, several department heads have submitted reports suggesting that the informal nature of these interactions has led to inappropriate commentary about palace operations and management decisions. Margaret stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Lady Morrison, that's completely unfair. Her Majesty has never criticized palace operations, and none of us have shared inappropriate information. Mrs. Thompson, Lady Morrison replied coolly, the issue isn't what was intended, but what has been perceived and reported. Perception becomes reality in palace operations. As you well know, the exchange encapsulated everything that was wrong with the situation. Good intentions had been filtered through institutional suspicion and political maneuvering until they had become unrecognizable. The authentic relationships that had developed were being destroyed by interpretations and implications that had nothing to do with the reality of what had occurred in this kitchen. Camilla realized that she was facing the same choice that had confronted her repeatedly throughout her royal life: surrender something meaningful to preserve institutional stability, or fight for personal authenticity at the cost of broader harmony. But this time, the stakes were higher because other people's livelihoods and reputations were involved. Margaret, Sarah, James, and the other kitchen staff were facing professional consequences because of their association with her attempts to find genuine human connection. Lady Morrison, Camilla said with quiet dignity, what specific actions are you recommending to address these concerns? Lady Morrison had clearly prepared for this question. Immediate suspension of all informal cooking lessons pending a full review of palace staff interaction policies. Formal statements from kitchen staff clarifying that no inappropriate information has been shared. And implementation of new protocols governing royal access to staff areas and activities. Each recommendation was reasonable from an institutional perspective, but collectively they represented the complete destruction of everything that had made the Tuesday morning lessons meaningful. Camilla looked at Margaret, whose expression revealed the pain of watching something precious being systematically dismantled. She thought about Sarah's enthusiasm for sharing traditional recipes, James's pride in his culinary skills, and all the moments of genuine human connection that had sustained her through months of formal royal obligations. I need some time to consider the best path forward, she said finally. Could we postpone any formal decisions until I've had a chance to discuss this situation with Prince William? Lady Morrison nodded, though her expression suggested she believed the outcome was already determined. Of course, Your Majesty, but I should mention that the longer these issues remain unresolved, the more difficult it becomes to manage the broader implications. As Lady Morrison departed, leaving Camilla alone with the kitchen staff, the silence was heavy with unspoken understanding. They all knew that this was likely their last Tuesday morning together, at least in the form that had become so meaningful to all of them. Margaret began cleaning up the pasta ingredients they would never use, while Sarah and James quietly returned to their regular duties. The comfortable workspace that had hosted months of learning and laughter felt like a crime scene where something precious had died. Camilla stood among the stainless steel surfaces and commercial equipment, realizing that she was about to lose the most authentic relationships she had formed since joining the royal family. The choice between institutional stability and personal connection was no choice at all when other people's careers were at stake. The kitchen that had been her sanctuary was about to become just another palace space governed by protocol and hierarchy, and she wasn't sure how she would bear the loss. 7. The emergency meeting convened in the blue drawing room at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon carried a weight of finality that everyone present could feel. Prince William sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Lady Morrison, Elena Rodriguez, and the Palace Workers' Union representative Thomas Mitchell, who had arrived that morning with a formal grievance that threatened to escalate beyond the palace walls. Camilla entered the room with the measured composure that years of royal training had ingrained in her, but those who knew her well could see the strain in her carefully controlled expression. The morning's confrontation in the kitchen had shaken her more deeply than she cared to admit, not just because of the personal loss it represented, but because of the broader implications for how she would be able to function within the constraints of royal life. Thomas Mitchell was a man in his late 50s who had spent his entire career advocating for palace workers' rights. He understood the delicate balance required to maintain both royal dignity and fair labor practices, but the situation that had developed around the cooking lessons represented a new challenge that threatened established agreements and precedents. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell began, addressing William directly, "the Union appreciates the opportunity to discuss these concerns before they escalate to formal grievance procedures. Our members have raised legitimate questions about equity and access that need to be addressed." William nodded gravely. "Mr. Mitchell, please explain the specific concerns that have been brought to your attention." Mitchell opened a folder containing detailed reports from various palace departments. "We've documented 17 separate instances over the past 6 weeks where kitchen staff members have received preferential treatment, informal access to Her Majesty, and opportunities for professional development that haven't been made available to other employees with similar lengths of service and dedication." The clinical language transformed months of warm human interaction into bureaucratic infractions, but Mitchell was simply doing his job of protecting worker interests within an institutional framework that didn't easily accommodate the kind of relationships Camilla had been trying to build. Additionally, Mitchell continued, several department heads have reported concerns that the informal nature of these interactions has led to breaches of established communication protocols. Staff members who previously followed proper channels for suggestions or concerns have begun approaching kitchen workers as intermediaries to reach Her Majesty. This revelation struck William as particularly problematic. If the cooking lessons had inadvertently created unofficial channels of communication that bypassed established palace hierarchy, the implications extended far beyond simple questions of fairness. The entire system of palace management depended on clear lines of authority and communication. "Teddy," Lady Morrison leaned forward to add her perspective. "Your Royal Highness, we've also received inquiries from other royal households about the precedents being set here. The informal access arrangements have attracted attention that could influence expectations throughout the royal system." Camilla listened to these concerns with growing despair. Every positive aspect of her Tuesday morning experiences was being reframed as an institutional problem that required correction. The genuine connections she had formed, the staff morale improvements that had been obvious to everyone, the simple human joy of learning together, none of these benefits seemed to matter when weighed against administrative convenience. "Mr. Mitchell," William said thoughtfully, "what specific remedies is the Union proposing?" Mitchell consulted his notes before responding. "We're requesting either the implementation of a structured program that provides equal access opportunities to all palace staff, or the discontinuation of preferential arrangements that create unfair advantages for specific employee groups." The proposal was eminently reasonable from a labor relations perspective, but Camilla understood its practical implications. A structured program with equal access would transform the authentic, spontaneous interactions that had made the cooking lessons meaningful into formal events that served everyone equally and no one well. Elena Rodriguez spoke up for the first time during the meeting. "Your Royal Highness, from a security and scheduling perspective, expanding these informal interactions to include all palace staff would present logistical challenges that might be difficult to manage effectively." William turned to address Camilla directly. "Your Majesty, you've heard the concerns that have been raised. What are your thoughts on how to proceed?" The question was both respectful and loaded. William was giving her the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process, but the weight of institutional pressure made it clear that there was really only one viable option. Camilla chose her words carefully. "I understand the concerns about equity and precedent. The last thing I wanted was to create problems for the staff members who have given me so much joy and learning over these past months." She paused, looking around the table at faces that represented different aspects of palace operations, all of which had been disrupted by her attempts to find authentic human connection within the royal system. "However, I need everyone here to understand what these Tuesday mornings have meant to me personally. For the first time since joining this family, I felt valued for who I am rather than what I represent. The relationships I formed weren't based on protocol or duty, but on genuine mutual respect and shared experience." The room fell silent as Camilla's words hung in the air. It was rare for a member of the royal family to speak so directly about the personal costs of royal duty, and her honesty created a moment of uncomfortable recognition for everyone present. The question we're really addressing, Camilla continued, isn't about cooking lessons or staff access. It's about whether authentic human relationships are possible within the constraints of royal life, or whether institutional requirements will always triumph over personal connection. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As a union representative, his job was to protect worker interests, but he hadn't expected this conversation to venture into such fundamental questions about the nature of royal existence. Lady Morrison maintained her composed expression, but William could see that Camilla's words had affected her. After 30 years of palace service, she had witnessed the personal sacrifices that royal duty required, and she wasn't insensitive to the human cost of the institutional requirements she was paid to enforce. William realized that this moment represented more than a decision about cooking lessons. How he handled this situation would establish precedents for how the monarchy balanced human needs against institutional requirements for years to come. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "I appreciate your honesty about the personal significance of these relationships. But I think we need to consider whether there might be ways to preserve the essential elements of what you valued while addressing the legitimate concerns that have been raised." The suggestion carried a note of hope that surprised everyone in the room. Given the complexity of the problems that had emerged, most of them had expected William to simply terminate the cooking lessons and implement new restrictions to prevent similar issues in the future. "Mr. Mitchell," William continued, "would the union be satisfied if we created a broader program of structured staff interaction opportunities that included but wasn't limited to the cooking lessons, something that provided various ways for royal family members to recognize and appreciate staff contributions?" Mitchell considered the proposal carefully. "Your Royal Highness, the Union would certainly be interested in discussing such a program, provided it was designed to be inclusive and equitable." Lady Morrison looked less enthusiastic about this direction. "Sir, expanding rather than restricting informal royal staff interactions could create additional complications rather than resolving existing ones." "Perhaps," William acknowledged, "but the alternative is to accept that authentic human connection is incompatible with royal duty. I'm not prepared to reach that conclusion without exploring other options." Elena Rodriguez began taking notes rapidly, recognizing that William was moving toward a decision that would require extensive planning and coordination. "However," William continued, and his tone shifted to carry the unmistakable weight of royal authority, "the current arrangements clearly cannot continue in their present form. The cooking lessons as they have been conducted are creating too many complications and inequities to be sustainable." Camilla felt her heart sink as she heard the words she had been dreading. Despite William's talk of alternative programs and broader solutions, her Tuesday mornings were effectively over. "Therefore," William said, looking directly at Camilla, "I'm instructing that all informal kitchen access be suspended immediately pending development of new policies that can address the concerns that have been raised." The formality of his language couldn't disguise the personal impact of what he was saying. He was effectively ending the relationships that had become most meaningful to his stepmother, not out of personal preference but because institutional requirements left no other viable option. Mitchell nodded with satisfaction. "The Union appreciates your Royal Highness's attention to these concerns." Lady Morrison also looked pleased, recognizing that William's decision validated the institutional priorities she had been advocating throughout this process. But William wasn't finished. "Lady Morrison, I want you to coordinate with Elena and Mr. Mitchell to develop proposals for structured staff recognition programs that could provide meaningful interaction opportunities. These proposals should be ready for review within 6 weeks." "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Lady Morrison replied, though her expression suggested she was less enthusiastic about this additional assignment. "Additionally," William continued, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone in the room pay closer attention, "I want to be absolutely clear about something. The kitchen staff who participated in these lessons did so at Her Majesty's invitation and conducted themselves with complete professionalism throughout. Any suggestions that they acted inappropriately or betrayed confidences are unfounded and unacceptable. The defense of the kitchen staff was both unexpected and significant. William was using his authority to protect the employees who had become caught in the political crossfire of this situation. Furthermore, he said, looking directly at Mitchell, I expect the union to ensure that no punitive actions are taken against any staff members who participated in these lessons. They were following royal instructions and should not face any negative consequences for their involvement. Mitchell nodded quickly. Absolutely, Your Royal Highness. The union has no intention of pursuing actions against individual staff members. As the meeting began to conclude, William turned to address Camilla one final time. Your Majesty, I know this isn't the outcome you hoped for, but I want you to know that I understand the value of what you were trying to create, and I'm committed to finding ways to preserve those elements within a framework that can be sustained long-term. Camilla nodded with as much grace as she could muster, but inside she felt the familiar sensation of authentic experience being bureaucratized out of existence. She understood the institutional necessities that drove William's decision, but understanding didn't make the loss any less painful. As the various officials filed out of the blue drawing room, William asked Camilla to remain behind for a private conversation. When they were alone, his formal composure softened slightly. I'm sorry, he said simply. I know how much those Tuesday mornings meant to you. Camilla managed a wan smile. You did what you had to do. I understand the position you're in. Actually, William said, reaching into his jacket pocket, there's something else I need to discuss with you. He withdrew a set of keys and placed them on the polished table between them. Camilla recognized them immediately. They were her personal keys to various private areas of the palace, including the kitchen spaces where she had spent so many meaningful hours. I'm afraid, William said quietly, that until we can establish new protocols and ensure that there are no further complications, I need to ask you to surrender access to staff areas that haven't been specifically cleared for royal visits. The request was delivered with obvious reluctance, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a command. William wasn't asking for her keys. He was requiring them. Camilla stared at the keys lying on the table, understanding that they represented far more than simple access to physical spaces. They represented her freedom to move authentically through the palace, her ability to connect spontaneously with the people who served her family, and her hope of finding genuine human relationships within the constraints of royal life. I see, she said quietly, though her voice carried undertones of something that might have been anger or might have been despair. This isn't permanent, William assured her. Once we've established new policies and protocols, we can review what kinds of access make sense going forward. But they both understood that once bureaucratic processes were imposed on human relationships, those relationships could never return to their original authenticity. The Tuesday morning cooking lessons might resume in some structured form, but they would never again be the spontaneous, genuine connections that had made them meaningful. Camilla picked up her keys and held them for a moment, feeling their familiar weight. Then, with the dignity that royal training had ingrained in her, she handed them across the table to William. No entry ever again, she said quietly, the words carrying a finality that surprised them both. William accepted the keys with obvious reluctance, understanding that he had just participated in destroying something precious in order to preserve institutional stability. The irony wasn't lost on him that in protecting the monarchy from the complications of authentic human connection, he might have sacrificed the very qualities that made the monarchy worth preserving. As Camilla left the blue drawing room for the last time with unrestricted access to the palace that had briefly felt like a real home, she carried with her the knowledge that she had discovered something wonderful and had it taken away not by malice or cruelty, but by the inexorable requirements of an institution that was larger and more powerful than any individual within it. The kitchen would continue to function efficiently. Meals would be prepared and served with the same professional excellence that had characterized palace operations for centuries. But the laughter, the learning, the genuine human connections that had made Tuesday mornings special would exist only in memory, another casualty of the endless tension between authentic human experience and institutional necessity that defined royal life. And in the weeks that followed, when Lady Morrison's structured staff recognition programs were implemented with their careful protocols and formal boundaries, everyone involved would understand that they were participating in a pale imitation of something that had once been real and meaningful, but could never be recaptured once it had been filtered through bureaucratic requirements. The cooking lessons were over. The relationships would endure only as memories, and Camilla would face the remaining years of her royal duties with the knowledge that she had briefly touched something authentic and wonderful, only to have it taken away by the very system she had spent her life learning to serve.